At 50 years old, Margaret Collins thought love was over. Her children had moved out. Her marriage had ended years ago, and her life had become quiet, predictable, and lonely. Then one afternoon, her kitchen sink broke. She called a plumber. An hour later, a man named Daniel Brooks knocked on her door. Simple uniform, toolbox in hand, soft voice. There was nothing remarkable about him, except one thing. 6 months later, she married him, and only after the wedding, Margaret discovered the truth. The man fixing her sink was a billionaire. But the biggest question wasn't how rich he was. It was why he pretended to be poor. Was Daniel testing her? Was it a coincidence? Or had he chosen her deliberately? And more importantly, could a relationship be built on a hidden identity actually be real? This is the story of love later in life. Second chances. And the man who hid his wealth to find something money couldn't buy. Margaret Collins lived in a quiet suburb outside Austin, Texas. At 50, her life looked stable from the outside. But inside, things were different. Her divorce 5 years earlier had left a deep emotional gap. Her children were grown. Her home felt too quiet. She worked part-time at a bookstore. Her days followed the same routine. Morning coffee, short drive to work, dinner alone, TV, sleep. Romance wasn't something she expected anymore. I thought that chapter was closed, she later said. But everything changed because of a broken sink. It was a Saturday afternoon when the pipe burst. Water flooded the kitchen floor. Margaret panicked and searched online. She called the first plumbing service she found. They promised someone within the hour. 55 minutes later, a knock. Daniel Brooks stood at the door. He looked ordinary. Work boots, blue uniform, toolbox. "Hi, I'm Daniel. You called about the sink." He spoke calmly, confidently. Margaret let him in. He worked quickly, efficiently. But before leaving, he noticed her bookshelf. "Do you like mystery novels?" he asked. She smiled. "I work at a bookstore." They talked for 10 minutes. Then he left. But something about him stayed. A week later, Margaret's porch light stopped working. She hesitated, then texted Daniel. He replied immediately. "I'll come by." He fixed the light, staying for tea. Conversation flowed easily. He was different. No ego, no pressure, just a calm presence. He asked about her life, her hobbies, her past. Before leaving, he said, "I enjoy talking with you." Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years. Comfort. Weeks turned into months. Daniel began checking in. "Is everything working okay? How's your day?" They met for coffee. I walked in the park. Shared stories. He told her he lived simply. No family. Just work. "I like fixing things," he said. "It keeps life grounded." Margaret believed him. At 50, she wasn't looking for excitement. She was looking for peace. And Daniel brought that. Their relationship developed slowly. No drama. No games. Just companionship. One evening, they walked through a quiet park. Daniel stopped. "I enjoy spending time with you," he said. Margaret smiled. "I enjoy it too." He gently held her hand. At 50, Margaret felt something unexpected. Butterflies. For the first time in years, she wasn't alone. 6 months later, Daniel invited her to dinner. Nothing fancy, just a quiet restaurant. After dessert, he spoke softly. "Margaret, will you marry me?" She was stunned. "At our age?" she asked. He smiled. "That's exactly why." She said yes. They planned a small wedding. Just family and close friends. No luxury. No extravagance. Simple. Just like Daniel. Or so she thought. After the wedding, Daniel said, "I want to show you something." They drove outside the city. Margaret noticed large gated properties. Eventually, they stopped at one. The gates opened. She stared. A massive mansion stood before her. "What is this?" she asked. Daniel took a breath. "Our home." Margaret froze. "You're joking." He shook his head. "There's something I never told you." Her heart raced. "I'm not just a plumber." He continued. "I own the plumbing company and several construction firms and real estate investments." Margaret whispered, "You're wealthy?" He nodded. "I'm a billionaire." Margaret sat in silence. "Why didn't you tell me?" Daniel looked emotional. "My first marriage ended because of money. She loved the lifestyle, not me." He continued. "I wanted someone who loved me without knowing what I had." He looked at her. "You treated me like a normal man." Tears filled her eyes. "You didn't test me?" she asked. "No, I just met you as myself." Life changed, but Daniel didn't. He still made coffee, still fixed things himself, still lived simply. Margaret didn't just marry a billionaire. She married a man who valued authenticity. At 50, she found love, respect, peace. Sometimes, love doesn't come when you're young. Sometimes it arrives quietly, with a knock on the door, a toolbox in hand, and a secret no one expected. Margaret called a plumber. Instead, she found her husband, and learned the greatest love stories don't always start with wealth. Margaret stepped into the mansion slowly. Everything felt unreal. High ceilings, marble floors, large windows overlooking acres of land. "This is yours?" she asked quietly. Daniel shook his head. "Ours." Margaret had lived simply for years. A modest home, a quiet routine, no luxury. Now, everything was different. But what shocked her most? Daniel still acted the same. He made coffee himself. He fixed a loose cabinet. He carried groceries. "You don't have staff for this?" she asked. He smiled. "I like doing things myself." That was the moment Margaret realized. He wasn't pretending to be simple. He truly was. A few weeks later, Margaret noticed something. Daniel left early every morning. Multiple phone calls. Private meetings. She overheard conversations about mergers, investments, acquisitions. It overwhelmed her. She began to feel insecure. "Your world is too big for me," she confessed one evening. Daniel looked surprised. "I married you, not your experience." "But I don't belong here," she whispered. He held her hand. "You belong wherever I am." One afternoon, a woman arrived at the gate. Elegant, confidence, cold. Margaret watched from the window. Daniel's face changed when he saw her. "Who is she?" Margaret asked. Daniel sighed. "My ex-wife." Margaret's heart dropped. The woman entered the house. "You moved on quickly," she said sharply. Daniel remained calm. "We're divorced." She looked at Margaret. "So this is the new one." Tension filled the room. "She doesn't even know you," the ex-wife continued. "She only sees the nice version." Margaret felt uneasy. "What do you mean?" she asked. The woman smirked. "Ask him why he pretended to be poor." Then she left. Silence followed. Margaret turned to Daniel. What did she mean? Daniel sat down slowly. "My first marriage was different," he admitted. "When I met her, I was already wealthy. Everything moved fast. Too fast." He continued. "She loved the lifestyle. The parties. The trips. The attention. But when business declined for 1 year, she changed. She became distant. Cold. Angry. Eventually, she filed for divorce. She took half," he said quietly. Margaret saw the pain in his eyes. "That's why you hid your wealth?" she asked. He nodded. "I didn't want to repeat the same mistake." Despite the wealth, Margaret felt restless. She didn't want to just live in luxury. "I need something of my own," she told Daniel. "What do you want?" he asked. She hesitated. "I want to open a bookstore." Daniel smiled. "Let's do it." But Margaret shook her head. "No, I want to build it myself." He respected her decision. She started small. A rented space. Used shelves. Limited inventory. Customers slowly came. At 50, Margaret was building her own identity again. Not as a billionaire's wife, but as herself. Months later, Margaret received a call. It was Daniel's business partner. "Daniel hasn't told you?" the man asked. "Told me what?" "There's a lawsuit. Someone is trying to take control of his company." Margaret's heart raced. When Daniel came home, she confronted him. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want you to worry." "Your ex-wife?" she asked. Daniel nodded slowly. "She's trying to claim more assets." Margaret realized. The past wasn't finished. The legal battle lasted months. Stress built. Media attention grew. But Margaret stayed. She didn't run. She didn't panic. She supported him. One night, Daniel said, "You're the first person who stayed without caring about money." Margaret smiled. "I didn't marry your wealth. I married you." That was when Daniel knew. He made the right choice. A year later, the lawsuit ended. Daniel won. Life returned to calm. Margaret's bookstore flourished. Their relationship deepened. Peace settled in. At 50, she didn't just marry a billionaire. She married a man who trusted her. And she proved, love built on truth lasts longer than love built on wealth. Margaret Collins married Daniel Brooks believing she had finally found peace. She wasn't just loved. She was respected, protected, seen. She built her bookstore. He won the legal battle against his ex-wife. Life finally felt stable. But just when everything seemed perfect, a secret from Daniel's past returned. And this time, it didn't just threaten his wealth. It threatened their marriage. It arrived on a quiet morning. No return address. No sender name. Just Margaret's name written neatly on the envelope. Inside was a single photograph. Margaret stared at it. It was Daniel, standing beside a younger woman, holding a baby. Her hands began to shake. Attached was a note. "He never told you, did he?" Margaret's heart pounded. Margaret waited all day. When Daniel came home, she showed him the photo. He froze. Silence filled the room. "Who is she?" Margaret asked quietly. Daniel sat down slowly. "That is from years ago." "And the baby?" she whispered. He closed his eyes. "My daughter." Margaret felt her world tilt. "You have a daughter, you never told me about it." Daniel spoke softly. "She was born before my first marriage. Her mother and I separated. She moved away." Margaret listened silently. "I supported them financially, but she wanted privacy. We lost contact years ago." "Why didn't you tell me?" Margaret asked. "I was afraid," he admitted. "I didn't want my complicated past to scare you." Margaret stood up. "You hid a child from me." Daniel looked devastated. "I was going to tell you. I just didn't know when." 2 days later, the doorbell rang. Margaret opened it. A young woman stood there. Late 20s. Nervous. Holding the same photo. "Are you Margaret?" she asked. "Yes. I'm Emily, Daniel's daughter." Margaret's breath caught. Daniel walked into the hallway and froze. "Emily," he whispered. Years of distance vanished instant. Emily stepped inside. "I didn't want to disrupt your life," she said. "But my mother passed away last month." Daniel's face filled with grief. "I tried to find you," she continued. "But you moved." She looked at Margaret. "I didn't know he remarried." Margaret felt torn between shock and empathy. Emily continued. "I'm not here for money. I just wanted to meet my father." Daniel hugged her tightly. Margaret watched quietly. Everything was changing. That night, Margaret sat alone. Her thoughts raced. A hidden daughter. A past life. A secret. She wondered. What else didn't she know? Daniel found her. "You're quiet," he said. "You hid something important from me," she replied. He nodded. "I was wrong." Margaret sighed. "I need time." Weeks passed. Emily stayed nearby. She visited often. Helped Margaret at the bookstore. Shared stories about her childhood. Slowly, Margaret saw something. Emily wasn't a threat. She was kind, respectful, grateful. One afternoon, Emily said, "I'm glad he found you. He seems happier." Margaret smiled. "Thank you." At that moment, the tension softened. One evening, Daniel sat beside Margaret. "I'm sorry I hid the truth." Margaret looked at him. "You made a mistake, but you didn't lie about loving me." He nodded. "I don't want secrets anymore." She took his hand. No more secrets. Their marriage survived the shock. Not because it was perfect, but because they chose honesty. At 50, Margaret learned something unexpected. Love later in life isn't about perfection. It's about forgiveness, truth, and choosing each other, even after the secrets are revealed. Margaret Collins thought the hardest part of her marriage was over. She had accepted Daniel's secret daughter. Emily had become part of their lives. The tension had faded. For the first time, they truly felt like a family. But peace didn't last long, because someone else was watching. And this time the threat didn't come from Daniel's past. It came from someone who wanted his future. Daniel hired a new executive assistant. Her name was Vanessa Carter. She was smart, elegant, confident. At first, Margaret didn't think much about her. Daniel mentioned her casually. She's organized, very efficient. But weeks later, Margaret noticed something. Daniel started working later. More business trips, more calls. It reminded her of something she had experienced before. Her first marriage. The fears slowly returned. One evening, Daniel's phone buzzed repeatedly. He was in the shower. Margaret glanced at the screen. "Vanessa, still at the office. Waiting for you." Margaret felt uneasy. When Daniel returned, she asked casually, "You're working late again?" "Yes, big project," he replied. Margaret nodded, but something felt off. Emily visited the bookstore one afternoon. "You seem distracted," she said. Margaret hesitated, then spoke. "I think Daniel's assistant might be getting too close." Emily frowned. "Do you trust him?" "Yes," Margaret said. "But I've seen this before." Emily thought for a moment. Maybe talk to him before assuming anything. Margaret agreed, but doubt remained. Daniel left for a 3-day business trip. The second night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She checked social media. A photo appeared. Vanessa, standing beside Daniel, at a dinner event. They looked close. Margaret's heart sank. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the fear was real. When Daniel returned, Margaret spoke calmly. "I saw the photo." Daniel looked confused. "What photo?" "You and Vanessa." He sighed. "It was a business dinner." Margaret nodded. "I just don't want secrets." Daniel sat beside her. There's nothing between us. I promise. Margaret wanted to believe him. But Vanessa wasn't done. Next week, Margaret received an anonymous email. Attached were photos. Daniel and Vanessa leaving the office late. Daniel and Vanessa in a car. Daniel and Vanessa laughing. Margaret's chest tightened. The message read, "He deserves someone younger." Margaret realized someone was trying to break them. But who? Emily investigated quietly. She discovered something shocking. Vanessa had been contacting tabloids, leaking rumors, creating a narrative. She wanted publicity. And possibly, Daniel. Emily confronted Daniel. He was furious. Vanessa was called into his office. "This ends today," Daniel said firmly. She tried to deny everything. But the evidence was clear. She was fired immediately. That evening, Daniel sat beside Margaret. "I'm sorry you had to go through this." Margaret sighed. "I was afraid, not because of her, but because I've been hurt before." Daniel took her hand. "I chose you. Not youth. Not appearances. You." Margaret smiled softly. At 50, she learned something important. Love later in life isn't threatened by younger faces. It's strengthened by trust. And sometimes, the biggest tests only prove how strong love really is. Margaret Collins finally felt settled. The drama with Vanessa was over. Daniel's daughter Emily had become part of their lives. The bookstore was thriving. At 50, Margaret had found love, stability, and purpose. But life has a way of testing happiness when you least expect it. And this time, the test came quietly. With a phone call, that changed everything. Daniel was in New York for business when Margaret received the call. It was Emily. Her voice sounded worried. "Margaret." Dad collapsed during a meeting. Margaret froze. "What happened?" "They think it's stress, but he's in the hospital." Margaret grabbed her keys immediately. The flight felt endless. Her mind raced with fear. She had found love again. She couldn't lose it. Margaret rushed into the hospital room. Daniel lay in bed, pale, weak. Seeing him like that broke her heart. "You scared me," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "I'm okay, just exhausted." The doctor entered. "We ran tests," he said. "There's something we need to monitor. His heart is under strain." Margaret's stomach tightened. This was the first time she realized Daniel wasn't invincible. Daniel was advised to reduce stress. Less work, more rest, lifestyle changes. At first, he resisted. "I built everything myself," he said. Margaret responded gently. "You also deserve to live." Emily agreed. For the first time, Daniel stepped back from business. He spent mornings walking with Margaret, afternoons at the bookstore, evenings at home. They rediscovered simple moments, the kind they almost lost. One night, Daniel spoke quietly. "What if something happens to me?" Margaret held his hand. "Don't say that." He continued. "I want to make sure you're protected." Margaret shook her head. "I don't care about money." "I know," he replied. "That's why I trust you." Daniel began reorganizing his assets. Not out of fear, but out of love. Emily began visiting more often. The three of them shared dinners, stories, laughter. Margaret realized something unexpected. She didn't just marry Daniel. She gained a family. Emily once told her, "I'm glad he found you. He's calmer now." Margaret smiled. Love changes people, even later in life. Months passed. Daniel's health improved. He worked less, lived more. One evening, he took Margaret to the place they first met. Her old house. The kitchen sink had been replaced. Daniel laughed. "This is where everything started." Margaret smiled. "You fixed more than a pipe that day." He looked at her softly. "You fixed my life too." Daniel recovered fully. But the experience changed them. They slowed down, focused on what mattered. Choose time over wealth. Margaret realized something powerful. At 50, she didn't just find love. She found someone worth fighting for. Sometimes, love isn't tested by betrayal. Sometimes, it's tested by fear. And when love survives both, it becomes unbreakable. It all started with a broken sink and a man pretending to be a plumber. But it became something more. A second chance at love, life, and forever. Margaret Collins never imagined calling a plumber at 50 would change her entire life. She found love. She found a family. She found purpose. After Daniel's health scare, they slowed down. They traveled less, worked less, lived more. For the first time, life felt complete. But neither of them knew. Tom was quietly preparing one final chapter. The next 2 years were peaceful. Margaret ran her bookstore. Daniel visited occasionally, greeting customers warmly. People didn't know he was a billionaire. They just knew him as Margaret's husband. He still dressed simply, still fixed things himself, still lived humbly. Sometimes, customers assumed he was a handyman. Daniel never corrected them. Margaret once asked why. He smiled. This is the real me. One evening, Daniel called Margaret and Emily into the living room. I've been thinking, he said. They listened quietly. I spent my life building wealth, but I want to leave something meaningful. Margaret squeezed his hand. What do you mean? Daniel explained. He planned to create a foundation, one that would support small business owners over 50, widows starting over, late-life entrepreneurs. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. You're helping people like me? She whispered. Daniel smiled. You helped me first. Months later, the Daniel Brooks Foundation launched. News outlets covered the story. Billionaire creates fund for second chances after 50. Margaret stood beside him at the small press event. He refused a grand stage. Just a simple announcement. I believe life doesn't end at 50, Daniel said. Sometimes it begins. Margaret felt proud. Their story was now helping others. One quiet morning, Daniel handed Margaret an envelope. What's this? She asked. Open it. Inside were documents. Her name on everything. The house. Investments. Businesses. Margaret looked shocked. Daniel, why? He spoke gently. Because you never cared about any of it. Tears filled her eyes. I only cared about you. He smiled. I know. Months later, Daniel's health declined again. This time more quietly. Margaret stayed beside him. Emily visited daily. One evening, Daniel whispered, calling that plumber was the best thing that ever happened to me. Margaret laughed softly through tears. You were the plumber. He smiled weakly. And you fixed my heart. He held her hand and closed his eyes. Peacefully, Margaret grieved deeply. But she didn't break. She continued the foundation, ran the bookstore, spent time with Emily. Daniel's legacy grew. Hundreds of people over 50 started businesses. Widows rebuilt their lives. Second chances became real. Margaret realized their love didn't end. It multiplied. One afternoon, a pipe burst in the bookstore. A young plumber arrived. Margaret smiled. He looked nervous. Sorry about the mess, he said. Margaret laughed softly. It's okay. I have a soft spot for plumbers. As he worked, she looked around the bookstore. In the photos, the memories, the life she built. At 50, she called a plumber. Instead, she found love, family, purpose, legacy, and she understood something powerful. Sometimes, the smallest moments create the biggest love stories. All it takes is a broken sink and a knock on the door. If you like this story, please comment, like, and subscribe for more real-life stories.